There are too many groups that need to be placated. And granted that I just said a few minutes ago that take Biden, for example, if he leaves the office having followed through on all of his promises, half the country will be very upset. How then would you measure the success of a presidency if half of the country is going to hate whatever gets done?
I don't think we measure leaders by popular approval. And I'm not even sure popular approval tells us what people really think. It tells us what they think they need to tell us that they think. I think we measure leaders by enduring accomplishments, what they do that makes a difference. So whether you were from a family that was pro-Abraham Lincoln or pro-Confederate, it doesn't matter. You can't deny that Abraham Lincoln kept the Union together. And Abraham Lincoln passed the legislation that built our land-grant universities, the universities that made our university system the best system in the world. And he invested in the railroads that connected our country and created the largest integrated market economy in the world that's made us the wealthiest country in the world. I mean, those are accomplishments you can't deny, whether you were on one side or another. Ronald Reagan, right? I'm not always a fan of Ronald Reagan, as you know from the book, but let's give credit where credit is due. He managed the end of the Cold War. He didn't create the end of the Cold War, but he managed a relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev that brought the Cold War to an end peacefully, right? So it is a few big things like that in the end matter most. My advice to presidents as a historian is pick a few issues that you think matter to the future of the country. Hopefully they'll also be popular issues, and invest in those, and don't try to solve most of the problems that you can't solve.
Well, just to play devil's advocate a bit, if we're measuring leaders based on enduring accomplishments rather than public opinion, and take Abraham Lincoln's saving of the Union, for example, the problem there, I think, is that public opinion and accomplishments can't be divorced, in the sense that many people in the South still wish that the Union hadn't been preserved. And to judge anything an accomplishment is an opinion.
I agree with that. I think you're right. That's the point of my more recent book on the legacies of the Civil War. Just as you said, there are people who are still refighting the Civil War today. It's how to understand a lot of politics, and not in Austin where I live, but in the larger state of Texas that I'm in. So I agree with that. But I also think that that's where there is something to the scholarly, learned perspective of looking at evidence and text and studying change. And I think most people who actually study what Lincoln did agree that he saved the Union. It doesn't mean they all agree on whether he did it exactly the way they would have done it or not. And that's different from the public myth making, right? And so that's where there is a difference. I don't mean to be elitist about it, but I mean to say there's a difference between having an opinion and having done the work of a historian or a philosopher or a scholar of any kind, and actually looking at the evidence before articulating a position.
Okay. So we appeal to experts who know history, economics, sociology, etc., to determine whether something is in fact an accomplishment. And we hopefully can do this, or hopefully they can do this without being ideologically prejudiced in some way. But of course...
Right. And I don't think we have to be, the people making the judgments have to only be the historians and the sociologists and others. They have to read our work and then decide. That's my point. That's, again, coming full circle, why we publish, why it's important as a historian not just to write for other historians, not just journal articles in a few places that only a few people read, but it's the larger works we write, and people can then read those, people who are educated, and they can make good judgments. That's what I think matters. So when someone tells me they have an opinion, I really don't want to know whether I agree with them or not. I want to know where they got that opinion from. And if they've actually done some work, even if they don't have a college education, but if they've done some work to read and actually look in the evidence, I give it more credence than if it's just spouted out, even if it's a very well-educated person.
I'm curious, though, I'm assuming that there are highly educated historians who would disagree with you about whether certain feats accomplished by certain presidents should be considered accomplishments.
Yes. And I think those are interesting debates. I chose as examples before the ones where there's pretty good consensus. But you're right. Let's take Lyndon Johnson, right? So there is a big debate among historians as to what Lyndon Johnson's role was in the civil rights movement. Some historians, who are more presidential historians, will say Lyndon Johnson was crucial. One of his great accomplishments is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ends public segregation, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which creates the first real protections for African-American voting in the South. And they give Johnson credit. Many historians of social movements, those who focus on the ground, those who focus at the local level, will say, no, Lyndon Johnson was pushed into this by John Lewis and by all the women in various churches in the South and all the marchers. And so it's a debate. Is that Lyndon Johnson's accomplishment or not? In those cases, I think we can accept that there are different points of view, but we still can recognize that those different points of view still bound our debate. What's not acceptable, you can argue one side or the other on what I just laid out. But what's not acceptable is to say that the civil rights movement didn't matter, or that the Civil Rights Act did not matter. It clearly mattered. Who we give credit to is debatable. And so, yes, we don't have to agree on everything. We never will. But we can agree on what the space of the appropriate argument should be. And much of our problem today, it's not unique to this moment, it was true in the early 20th century, is that we're arguing over things sometimes for which there is no evidence and there really is no legitimate claim. And I want us to have the arguments that matter over the things where we have evidence.
So this makes sense. So the opinions of the experts still constrain the historical debate in the same way that maybe a debate about the effectiveness of vaccines shouldn't have to entertain objections about Bill Gates putting microchips in all of our skin, something like that. Precisely.
Or the example I've confronted, right, is people who say, well, why didn't you have a climate change denier at your conference on climate change? There's a legitimate debate over what's causing climate change and how much it is, but I don't think it's legitimate to say that there's no climate change. That's not part of the accepted debate.
Okay, so just to put a bow on this, and I think that this has been really helpful. So there is room for experts to debate what is an accomplishment, but we should be appealing to experts who can articulate what an accomplishment is for judging the success of a presidency, as opposed to just taking a popular vote on whether it was successful.
Exactly. And just the one thing I would add to that is when we're appealing to experts, we don't have to agree with what the experts say, but we have to look at the evidence they present. We have to have an evidence-based argument.
Okay. And this also, I guess, raises another problem or issue in that it's much easier for us in hindsight to judge the success of, say, Washington's presidency than it is to judge the success of Biden's presidency as it's occurring, because the evidence hasn't been accrued, reviewed, debated among the scholars. But I think this is probably something to be expected.
Yeah, I think we have to accept that. I think what you said is 100% true. And what that means is that we have to recognize that our judgments are contingent. And we know less now than we'll know in 20 years about Biden's presidency, not just because of the evidence, but also you can't see the effects of the policy for a while, right? So we can judge the effects of the infrastructure investments. Maybe they'll make our economy grow more. Maybe the infrastructure investments will create more corruption. Who knows, right? But we'll only see that in 20 years. So we make the best judgment we can now based on the evidence that we have and recognize the limits of that. And that's why we shouldn't be so polemical or extreme. My argument against extremism is humility. Recognize you don't know as much as you think you know.
Okay. And now bracketing this question of what makes a presidency successful, am I right then in inferring so far that you think on average, because there's room for outliers, earlier presidents were much more successful than contemporary presidents?
Yes. I think the job has become harder. So I think I think we have equally talented people most of the time, not all the time, but we have equally talented, if not more talented people. But the job is so much harder and they don't understand the job. The smartest people can actually do the worst things because they believe that their smarts will get them through the circumstances. But circumstances matter more. The conditions you're in matter more than what you yourself do.